Good morning, everyone. My name is Sam Stevens, and I am with the William Trent House Museum in Trenton, New Jersey, and I'm here to welcome you to this session, Sharing New Jersey's Indigenous Culture and History with Children, Youth, and Adults. I will just take a few minutes to introduce our speakers, and then we'll move right into the presentations. But I did want to start by saying, those of you who listened to our keynote heard many questions about this very issue of how to share Indigenous culture and history with elementary school children, with young people in high school, and with adults. So I'm hoping that today, while you won't get answers from us, you'll get some ideas, and then pose your questions in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to address them. So I would like to introduce, in the order in which they'll be speaking, my co-presenters. Trinity Norwood is a citizen of the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape tribal nation in South Jersey. She is an advisor to the tribal youth group, as well as the head coordinator for the Tribal Royalty Program. As an advocate for Indigenous peoples, Trinity works to promote and educate about Indigenous issues through multiple mediums, including art, film, and literature. She founded Native New Jersey, a nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading awareness, dispelling stereotypes and misconceptions about Native people, and educating both students and teachers alike about Native history, culture, and current events. Patricia Coleman is president of Friends for the Abbott Marshlands. She has retired from a career as a management executive in the pharmaceutical industry and has been a board member and active volunteer in a number of local nonprofit organizations, including most recently the Bowman's Hill Wildlife Preserve. Pat has a BA in anthropology and an MS in technology education. She finds the Abbott Marshlands to be an unfolding treasure of both cultural and natural history, a place worthy of continued research, interpretation, and preservation. Michael MacEwan is on the board of the Abbott Friends for the Abbott Marshlands. He went to Stockton College in New Jersey, where he studied environmental science and biology. His interests are in population dynamics and animal behavior, and he has been fortunate enough to work with blue crabs, 3 different seal species, diamondback terrapins, and after graduation, gray wolves in Minnesota. While sitting by a pristine lake in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness, he realized he wanted to get youth excited about environmental science. So he came back to New Jersey to start teaching science and has been an educator in many different settings since then, sharing his love of the environment and helping people experience nature around them. And as I mentioned, I am a trustee for the Trent House Association, which manages and operates the William Trent House Museum for the city of Trenton. I've been involved in working to expand our interpretation of the site and the many peoples connected with it. I serve as a representative of the association on the Sankofa Collaborative, which presents workshops and panels on African American history, and I have a Ph.D. in sociology. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and turn it over to Trinity.
Thank you, Sam. I have a PowerPoint, but it's just a few things. So I'm going to start out. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Sam. My name is Trinity. I am a citizen of the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape Nation right here in New Jersey. I'm excited to be able to be here, well, virtually with you all today, and to be a part of this awesome project. When I was in school, The section in our history books that spoke about Native Americans was a few paragraphs long, or a page if you were lucky, that typically had more pictures than actual words. Native people were talked about in this generalized past tense, and concentrated mostly on Western Plains tribes, and typically only about the interaction of those tribes with European colonists. And unfortunately, even though that was almost 20 years ago now, not too much has changed. A study published in 2015 in the Journal of Theory and Research in Social Education found that 27 out of our 50 states did not mention any individual Native Americans in their K through 12 standards, which means it was, like I said previously, just a generalized statement about Native people and not acknowledging our distinct diversities. And 87% of state history standards across the country did not cover Native American history after 1900. That's over 100 years ago. And just the fact that I could only find, the most recent study I could find was a 2015 study, is a pretty sad testimony. At one point in my schooling career, I can remember that there was a history book that concluded its Native American section by saying that Lenape people had left the East Coast and were all living on reservations in Oklahoma, while I, as a Lenape person, was sitting in the classroom right there. And I remember having to fight back tears as my peers looked at me questionably, because it's in their history book, so it must be correct, right? And unfortunately, this isn't an uncommon situation for Native students. In 2019, the National Indian Education Association surveyed more than 13,000 American Indian and Alaskan Native students, and they found that elementary school students had teachers who never or rarely incorporated Indigenous culture or history into their language arts classes. Although the damage of feeling erased in my classroom has stayed with me to this day, so does the pivotal moment in my educational journey that I felt seen for the first time as a Native person. It didn't happen until I was in high school, but I had an English teacher that added a section on contemporary Native writers to her curriculum. And not only did I personally feel seen, but her recognizing that Native people were contributing to our modern world, and not just a paragraph in a history book, inspired many of my fellow non-Native students to expand their perspective and gain a newfound respect and understanding for Native people, which was such an uplifting experience that I still get butterflies talking about today. It was those positive and negative experiences, along with some inspiration from my father, that led me to stand up and require change. I wanted future generations of Native students to be able to be unapologetically Native in their classrooms and create classrooms that taught Native history because it is American history. And so, for the past decade or so, I have visited classrooms, worked with teachers, schools, and educational organizations to change the way Native history and current issues are taught and studied in schools. I started out with small presentations, usually at the elementary school level, with mostly just some dancing and some coloring pages, and has now grown into teacher trainings and cultural consultations across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. I have a few slides. Let me make sure I am sharing this. In many of the schools that I have visited throughout the past decade, I have encountered misinformation, like students not knowing that tribes even exist here on the East Coast, damaging misconceptions like all Native live on reservations. There are no reservations here in the state of New Jersey, and there are Native people here, so that's easy to debunk. I've been told that Native people don't pay taxes. I pay my taxes. And that all Native communities want or have a casino. Here in New Jersey, our tribal community has law against profiting from vice. These misconceptions can be greatly damaging to Native communities at large. And for a student hearing these things in a classroom being misinterpreted as fact, it's very alienating. I've encountered students that don't even know what tribe's ancestral lands they are living on or attending school on. Students who have never heard of or learned anything about the true history of some of our common holidays, Columbus Day and Thanksgiving being the two biggest ones. The lack of information on historical events like relocations, the Indian boarding school era, and federal laws affecting Indigenous communities. Having some level of understanding on these issues allows students to understand the foundation of the current issues facing tribal communities today. I remember I was in a classroom, and this was a middle school classroom, and I had a student that was embarrassed to ask a question. So she came up to me after and she asked if Native people drink blood, because she had been told that, and she was upset because she knew it felt wrong, but she couldn't understand, she couldn't figure out how to get the correct information. And we had to have a conversation with the whole classroom, identifying the difference between Native Americans and vampires. And it was a difficult conversation for me to have, and it was heartbreaking that at some point in her life she had gotten that information and thought that it was true. But it was also such a blessing to be able to spread awareness and have that teaching moment with her classroom. These are things that I have encountered during presentations at all grade levels as well, even the collegiate level. Misconceptions and biases like these are damaging to modern Native communities and students sitting in the classroom where this misinformation or lack of information is being spread. They contribute to the continued erasure of Native peoples and create a sense of otherness in the minds of students. It's like Native people might be here, but they're not really here. They're in the woods or a part of some other reality that doesn't affect modern America. We must stand up and fight against this misinformation. Native people are here, they survived, they are thriving, they are contributing members to our modern day society, and you can still see pieces of our ancestors in the foundations of our modern society. A great example of this is the concept of democracy. Some of the roads and many of us are going to drive on today, perhaps, and the towns we live in and the streets we live on are named after Lenape people, communities, and even some of the towns that we currently live in are on top of ancestral villages. To think of Native culture or to perpetuate this misconception of Native culture being otherness, we are living in it and on top of it as we speak. Programs like the one that we are working on with the Trent House and the one created by Abbott Marshlands that you're going to hear about soon can create foundations of change in dispelling these types of misconceptions and misinformation. These programs can benefit everyone. They benefit teachers because teachers are already very overwhelmed in our system. And these can serve as a simple and easy reference for teachers to be able to expand their curriculum. In many states across the country, there have been laws created over the past few years that require Native American history education, but those laws don't include references or funding to make it easier for teachers. So what I try to do and what our project is trying to do is help bridge that gap for our already overwhelmed teachers. It also allows for greater depth in all subjects, not just history. Native people are absolutely a part of history and are a large part of our American history, but it doesn't just stop there. It doesn't just stop at 1900. There are Native people currently contributing to our world today in all different ways, and can be a part of all subjects: language, arts, music, history, social studies, everything. It benefits our students, of course. It creates an inclusive environment for Native students, and it allows space for a greater perspective and worldview for non-Native students. It creates an interactive experience that can stay with students. I have been working with a school in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia school, oh gosh, maybe for about 6 or 7 years. And it is so encouraging to me that when I was able to visit the school, I would have students that were years away from second grade is what I could go and get to visit. And they would come in whenever they heard I was coming, and they say, hey, you know, we spend time learning about Native history in my house now. I remember your presentation and it meant so much to me. So these kinds of experiences can be so lasting, and they plant a seed in a student that can grow in ways that I never anticipated, and I'm so blessed by. Another thing that the students have done at the Philadelphia school is that they wanted to incorporate Native history and information in their other classrooms. And a group of students decided to do a presentation to the whole school about Lenape history. And so really was my one presentation got to be a wonderful butterfly effect that added Native information and history to all aspects of their learning experience. Having an inclusive curriculum benefits Native communities. You're creating young allies. You know, allyship is something that has become a big thing as of recent. And the conversation of how to be an ally to marginalized communities has become a big topic. And to create a better future, create allies for the future. Bringing in local and Native issues to the forefront by educating these young people and adults alike on the history and the current issues of Native people, allow them to become a larger part of the conversation about the issues that are facing America, because oftentimes they are thought of separate. That's affecting tribal communities, that's not affecting Americans. We are Americans, our issues are our country's issues. Having inclusive curriculum fights cultural appropriation, the mysticism of Native culture, and of course, erasure. And also it takes the burden off Native governments to teach about themselves. I talk in my presentation sometimes about what I call the Indian in the cupboard complex. So many people assume that we are sitting here being Native, waiting for somebody to acknowledge our nativeness. And that's not what a tribal government is. It is a sovereign nation trying to manage and take care of its people, to also put the burden on that government to supply educational needs and things of that nature outside of its community. Is a difficult thing for Native communities to balance, particularly right now in our history, as Native communities have been greatly impacted through the pandemic. So making this a part of curriculum takes some of that burden off of Native communities to do it all on their own. Programs like the one we're working on at the Trent House are by no means a fix-all, but they are a step in the right direction towards inclusion, education, and a better tomorrow, which is really what I think it all boils down to. Wanting a better future for our young people. And we can't have that if all of our young people, Native students included, don't feel welcome in the classroom. And so that is my little presentation. I have spent the past 10 years on this educational journey, learning about my people, myself, and other people, and the connections that I have been able to make and the differences that we have been able to make for the community together have been monumental. And I am very excited for the next steps here in New Jersey. Wanishi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Trinity. Sorry it took me a minute to jump in here. I'm Pat Coleman, and it's an honor to follow the speakers that I've heard already this morning. I'm very grateful to the conference for all you've done here. I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience trying to build an education program. And I'm with the Friends for the Abbott Marshlands, so I'd first like to show you a diagram of where we are. This is an aerial overview of the Abbott Marshlands. It is about 3,000 acres of open space, a tidal freshwater marsh. So it's an amazing natural area in the midst of a heavily urbanized area. Importantly, it's also a National Historic Landmark archaeological site, one of only 2 in New Jersey, with significant evidence of Lenape heritage. And just to give you a location and a larger context, here we are located really between Trenton and Bordentown, and it is somewhat central to Lenape-Hoking area. The educational program that we put together is the combined efforts of the Friends for the Abbott Marshlands and the Tulpahacking Nature Center. Both of these organizations in part have come together to try and let more people understand and appreciate the Abbott Marshlands, both their natural and cultural history. What we realized, though, is that although both organizations had experience with the environmental aspects of the land, we really can't tell the story of the land without telling the story of the people. And for a long time, we felt uncomfortable taking on that story, like we were not properly prepared. We didn't know enough to tell the story. So we set out together on a project with a goal of developing a research-based curriculum and site-specific programs on archaeology and Lenape history in the marshlands. And we set aside some funds and a period to work on this. We developed an RFP, which explained what we wanted to do. And then we sent that RFP out to people who we knew something about the history of the Lenape on the land, which, as it turns out, were all archaeologists. So this little star here is the first indication of one of the lessons we've learned along the way. If we were to start on a program like this today, we would be sure that we were sending this RFP beyond just a group of archaeologists. So it was one of our first lessons learned. So we were fortunate, though. We did find some wonderful archaeologists to work with on this project. We ended up hiring Bryce Obermeyer from the Delaware Tribe Historic. He was the Delaware Tribe Historic Preservation Officer. He is also an anthropologist, and he has also spent a lot of time working in the Abbott Marshlands. He was the editor, a guest editor of the Archaeological Bulletin of New Jersey, which specialized in understanding the archaeology of the marshlands. We also had 2 wonderful technical advisors, Michael Stewart, a professor from Temple University, and Greg Latanzi, the curator of the New Jersey State Museum, who all agreed to work together to get us started in this process. The expected project outcomes, the initial goal was to get together 5 educational activity-based programs for school students. And our idea was anywhere from 3rd grade to middle school. So we wanted a series of programs that were ready to go. These would be primarily for delivery by the Tulpa Hacking Nature Center staff, to be able to have school groups come to the Nature Center and learn about these programs, or else have Nature Center staff go and visit the schools. But a secondary focus, and this one I think was especially important to the Friends, is that we really wanted to build a solid knowledge base so that we could develop future programs for all ages. We do more adult programming. The Nature Center wanted to be able to do additional school programs, and also kind of train the trainer teacher programs. And because of this, the way we went through our process was slower and more deliberate, because we really wanted to learn the background information. So one of the things that we learned early in the process was just how complex the history of the Lenape people are today. And we identified early on the fact, and through Bryce, that we should communicate whatever programs we developed to the 3 state recognized tribes in New Jersey, to the 4 federally recognized tribes, and to the 3 Canadian First Nations. So that was, again, an important learning process for us. As we developed these curriculum, we wanted to make sure that we shared what we were doing with these other groups and gave them an opportunity to comment on anything that we were doing. We then developed a series of themes for the programs. Another lesson learned was how important it is, and by now you've heard this over and over again, but one of our lessons is how important it is to emphasize that the Lenape are still here, they're present today. Where are they? How did they get there? And just to emphasize the importance of that in each of our programs. We also decided to do a program on Charles Abbott and the antiquity of man, on the Lenape deep history of land going back thousands of years, a program on connections to the land, and the final theme we developed was one on Lenape culture. So for each of these themes, we went into an extensive period of looking at background material. Bryce was our primary reference here, bringing materials together for us, and we had multiple rounds of discussions to help us to understand what was there. We built a series of references, educational standards that would be addressed in the school program. We began to build a list of materials that would be necessary for each of the primary activities, and also looked at opportunities to extend the lessons to develop new activities. Whoops. I do not know if you are still there, but my screen temporarily disappeared. Okay, it's back. Sorry about that. Okay, so our process right off the bat was interrupted by COVID delays. And we ended up needing to do a lot of this work through Zoom meetings. A new learning process for us was that we really needed somebody with more elementary education expertise. And it was at that point that Mike MacEwan came into our process. We completed a series of draft theme documents on each of the themes. And then we prepared a summary document about that basically outlined the content that we were going to include in our programs. We then submitted that summary document to each of the tribes, both the state recognized tribes and the federally recognized tribes, for comment. We wanted to let them know what they were doing and give them an opportunity to comment or to ask to see the full program summaries. Then we held a series of train the trainer sessions And finally, our plan was to pilot these programs, although I will say that we still haven't, again, because of COVID, we haven't been able to complete the pilots of all of these programs yet, but we're just about ready to do most of them. So another important step in our learning process was the importance of land acknowledgements. And we did end up putting a land acknowledgement on the front page of our website. Just a simple acknowledgement that says we're situated in Lenape-Hoking, traditional and ancestral land of the Lenape. We pay respect to the Lenape past, present, and future, and to their continuing cultural heritage and connection with this homeland. And each of our programs will begin with this land acknowledgement. Another thing that our programs will begin with is a timeline. One of the things that's difficult to for many of us to understand, not just children, is the deep history of the Lenape on this landscape, and our programs do extend across this history. So each of our programs will begin with an introduction to the time period, recognizing that the Lenape history goes back here well over 10,000 years. So the Lenape Today program that we developed primarily focused on relocation histories. One of my personal understandings from working with this program is just how difficult the challenge for the Lenape people was, in part because they were the first people that the European settlers encountered. And in many instances, over and over again, there were pressures to relocate. And of course, there are always pressures to stay in your homeland. And so this program explores those pressures to leave and pressures to stay. It has some activities based on maps, and depending on the level of the children, it also will sometimes get into some of the early treaties and problems with removals as the Lenape moved across the landscape. The second program that we developed is on Charles Conrad Abbott and the Antiquity of Man. I would guess that most of our audience is not very familiar with this, but Professor Deloria this morning referred to the understanding the history of the landscape. And this was a really important topic in the late 18th century. Charles Conrad Abbott is the reason we're named the Abbott Marshlands. And he began to find artifacts that he thought were from Paleolithic man. One of the results of his finds was that he ended up inviting archaeologists from all over the country and even some from Europe who came to this landscape to look at the evidence of Native Americans. In fact, many of those artifacts that are in the Peabody Museum in Harvard today have come from the Abbott Marshlands, where our lands is. And Abbott worked for the Peabody Museum at Harvard for a while. So in this program, we talk about finding evidence from the past and some of the challenges of that along the way, and actually give the kids an opportunity to learn something about the science of archaeology. We also have a Lenape Deep History program, which talks about how long the Lenape were in the marshlands, talks about some of the evidence that exists for it being an important ceremonial gathering place, especially in the woodland period, in the more recent woodland period. We talk about some of the evidence of that, and the activities particularly focus on Abbott's own pottery. And some of the designs that you see here are specific designs that were developed right in this local area that are expected to be ceremonial and evidence of these large gatherings and celebrations. We also have a theme on Lenape connections to the land, and this theme will be one that we develop future activities on, but for instance, we'll be doing an activity on plant materials and food from the land. But the first activity we developed was stone and stone tools. And really looking at the evidence from the stones that were found on the land and what it tells us about the way people solve the problems of their daily lives. So this is a really exciting activity for us. And one of the things that we asked the students to do is to think about what it was like to live in the Middle Woodland period and how they would have accomplished their daily tasks. And you look at the types of tools that people created and understand what not just the tools, but the materials for the tools, and what an extensive understanding of the landscape the people needed to have in order to collect the right materials for the right tools. So the last theme that we worked on was one on Lenape culture, song, and dance. And I think, Mike, I'm going to ask you to step in here for a minute and talk a little bit about this one.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I realize this is the first time you've seen me. So the Lenape culture was the most difficult to work on. And it morphed from what it was originally to what it became. And what it became was an effort to showcase the people, the traditions, and the stories, right? And so it became, okay, well, maybe what we end up doing is we show them a tribal dance, a bean dance. Or maybe we start making instruments. And so initially we were focused on, okay, this is how to make leg shakers, which women would wear. Or this is how we make a rattle, which would be more played by men in a ceremony. And so we kind of went, okay, well, we'll make instruments and maybe we'll play some simple rhythms. But that felt not enough. And so we started to say, okay, well, maybe we showcase when they would play this music. And then we'd start talking about different dance types. Is it a stomp dance or, and so we kept trying to figure out the way. And the deeper we got, I'll be honest, it was uncomfortable because the realization is it's not my story to tell. It's not my role. I can't tell a story that's not mine. And so as we got deeper into this cultural piece and you know, making the instruments and kind of playing simple beats was my comfort zone. I thought that would be okay. We can say this is how, you know, Indigenous people used local resources, turtle shells and things that were found to make sound, right? And I thought that would be okay. But as we got deeper into specific songs and then specific dances, it wasn't mine. It didn't feel right to me. And we had this discussion and it was pretty candid between the team, you know, like I don't want a non-native educator to teach kids how to do a tribal song and dance. It's not right. And so this kind of led to the discussion of what is our role in all of this. And we had been pretty mindful all along of you know, as a white male, how do I best engage kids in this story and in learning and shaking these kind of misconceptions that may be there. And so we'd had that lens, but this particular activity really pushed us in a direction that, you know, we've you know, the Friends invested a lot of money to create these activities, and this one in particular, and we put it on the shelf. You know, we decided that it is not our place. And I think that there's power there, right? That I honor and acknowledge the Friends for allowing that investment to sit on a shelf, and maybe we hand it off to someone who's better suited, but until that person comes along, we will not be doing this activity, and because it's not our place. And I think that's as anyone considers these types of activities, I think it's important to continually reflect upon honoring the people, working with the people, and being mindful that it's not always right to do something. So
thank you. Thanks, Mike. That's really helpful. Yeah, this was a long process for us to get to the point. It's why I have it starred. It was a lesson learned that this was probably just not the right path for us. So in summary, I'll just bring back to you our lessons learned in trying to develop a curriculum. The first lesson is, if you're going to send out an RFP, make sure you include tribal contacts. A second one is that once you develop some materials, you should consider sending out those materials to tribal representatives to give them an opportunity to comment. It's really important to highlight the presence of the Lenape Today in all the programs. We would also certainly recommend the development of a land acknowledgement statement. This is something that the educators in the group already know, but it was a lesson for us. You need expertise in both the subject matter and education at whatever level of student you're going to be working for. And then the final lesson is that some topics may not be appropriate for your programs. So with that, I will stop my share and turn things back over to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Pat and Mike and Trinity. I'm excited to be able to share a little bit about what the Trent House is doing, building on our relationships with all of our other presenters. I'm going to share my screen now and give you a little bit of background. So this is our theme for our talk today. The first thing I wanted to do was share with you the mission and vision for the Trent House, and this is new to us. We adopted this in late 2020, but it does reflect an ongoing interest and commitment of the Trent House to talking about all the stories that connect with our museum, with the property that we're on, with Trenton, and so on. So we had done this, begun this with the enslaved people on the property. We've added some more information on women, in the, you know, as you may guess, early on, our focus, meaning decades ago, our focus was really very much on William Trent solely. And so we gradually began to expand our interpretation, our sense of what our responsibility was, and adopted this mission statement last year. How we think about the stories we want to tell is how people's lives are connected through the land. The museum now sits as a small island of about 2+ acres in Trenton. It is surrounded by state office buildings, parking lots, and highways. It sort of sits there all on its own as a little oasis. It's what remains of the 1,000 acres that William Trent owned when he lived there between 1714 and 1724. which is about 25% of Trenton's current footprint. But of course, it only represents a fraction of New Jersey and the whole eastern mid-Atlantic area that was home to the Lenape people and their ancestors. We have archaeological evidence. Pat mentioned this, what they have in the Abbott Marshlands, but we also have archaeological evidence of Lenape people's activities on the site going back 8,000 years. So we think of all of the human history connected with this land that represent what Trenton is now as part of our responsibility to investigate and to share to the extent we can. Like other museums and organizations, we've adopted a land acknowledgement statement, and it appears in our website and at the beginning of public programs. It is has pretty standard components, recognizing the land that we occupy now and the whole city of Trenton as part of the traditional territory of the Lenape, recognizing that many Lenape people were forced out of New Jersey, but some have remained and continue to remain in tribal communities here, and that we acknowledge the Lenape as the original people of the land and that they have an ongoing relationship with this territory. What we're hoping to do is, through a project that I'm going to tell you about, is to take this acknowledgement and make it demonstrated as a real part of our mission. And this really follows in the path of what the Tupelhocking Nature Center and the Friends of the Abbott Marshland have done. Our long-term goals for our work to understand and to share the history and culture of the Lenape people, the impact of colonial era interactions on the mix of people that then were there during that time, starting a little before Trent occupied the property, going into the early 1800s, the impact on all the different population groups, how institutional policies and actions have affected Lenape history, and how the Lenape have contributed to our history as a nation, have been part of our history, and they continue to shape their own identity today. As we think about this work, we're kind of balancing the idea of agency and mutual influence. In other words, that Lenape people were not passive, powerless recipients of people coming in, but had agency and had mutual influence, both historically and today, versus or side by side with changing power dynamics between Europeans and Native people and racism as it affects Lenape people and other groups in our society today. So one of the first things that we've done is think about what our approach ought to look like. And I'll tell you in a minute about our great fortune in having a great team and models to emulate. But these are our initial thoughts on how we're going to approach this work that we want to do, which we think of as a long-term and ongoing part of our interpretation at the museum. We want to make sure that we are able to point out and describe distinctive features of Lenape history and culture, distinctive compared to other Native peoples, but also describe that history and culture independently of European contact and American policies, but also as impacted by them. Very important to us is to use Native voices in our programs, from the historical record, from contemporary writings, and from oral histories. We'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And to affirm that Lenape people still live on their homeland and practice their culture today. So those, and you've heard those before as critical pieces of sort of a philosophical understanding of how we should approach our interpretation. So what we've done so far, we've conducted archaeological research, as I pointed out, and we've tried to share this information on the Native American artifacts that we have collected. We've encouraged, and we've shared this with the other federally recognized tribes, as well as sharing some of this information with the state recognized tribes in New Jersey. We attend meetings of the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs, which has been extremely helpful in educating us on the issues that affect the Lenape people today in New Jersey. Issues, some of which are some that affect the entire nation, but have had a differential effect on Native people, like the COVID pandemic, but others are specific to issues related to, for example, the relationship between state recognized Lenape tribes and federally recognized Delaware tribes. We've hosted programs and events that present and celebrate Native American history. And we've engaged members of Lenape and Delaware tribes and other partners in framing our work. And that's what I want to acknowledge right away here with our partners. So we have a team of 3 young women, one of whom you've met, Trinity, and 2 others, as well as a professor at Montclair, who are our guiding team, at least at the moment. Brianna D'Agostino is a graduate from Montclair, and she's now in the master's program in history at Rowan University. And she, like Trinity, is a member of the Nanticoke Lenni-Lenape tribe. Karel Hall is a Ph.D. candidate in anthropology at Rutgers, and Delaware tribe in the state of Delaware. And Christopher Matthews is a professor of anthropology at Montclair State University. Their team members with us are leading our current work, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we hope the products of that will be. We're very grateful to our funders who partnered with us on this, thinking that we have, some capacity to do this work, and giving us the trust of their funding: the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, the New Jersey Historic Trust, and the new NJM Insurance Group, formerly the New Jersey Manufacturers. And I want to give another shout out to Tukwalhaken Nature Center and the Friends for the Abbott Marshlands. Their careful work and deep consideration of the issues that they've laid out already, that Pat and Mike laid out, is really a model for us. And we also hope that as they continue to focus on maybe younger children in some of their programs, at least at the moment, that we will complement that by some of our programs that we're hoping to develop that are for middle and high school students. And we've also been greatly supported by the New Jersey State Museum and Greg Latanzi, who Pat mentioned already. And I should also have mentioned on here Hunter Research, Richard Hunter and his colleagues at Hunter Research, who have done our archaeological work, and Richard Veit, who has joined them in that work. And they have been important contributors to our understanding of the archaeology side of this work. Next steps. So with our team that I've just introduced you to, we're developing a framework for ongoing engagement, research, and programming. We're hoping to develop basically a menu or a kind of framework of about 10 major themes or that we can continue to explore and elaborate on with programs, exhibits, talks, etc., over the next number of years. So that's our first thing that we're doing, and we're in the middle of it right at the moment. We are especially interested in engaging Lenape youth and giving input and feedback on that framework. We are so lucky to have Brianna, Carell, and especially Trinity to help us in that. And we are reaching out to other groups who can help us connect with Lenape youth. We're also, of course, going to be engaging the New Jersey Commission and others in that feedback and input. We have a special interest, though, on the youth. And we're hoping to organize multi-generational oral history storytelling between Lenape youth and Lenape elders. There are some important aspects of more recent Lenape history that are in the memories of current leaders of the Lenape tribes in New Jersey that we want to capture, and we think that youth of those communities will be an important, it would be important to engage them in getting those oral histories documented. And our goal, besides the framework, which we will use going forward, is to produce some 3 short introductory videos and accompanying materials that will take 3 different sets of themes from that framework, using input and feedback from Lenape youth and others, using the stories that we get through the Oral History Project, and producing those 3 short introductory videos, which we hope could be used then in middle and high school classrooms, as well as at the museum, in introducing young people and adults to some important history and current issues of the Lenape people. So that is my presentation. Thank you all, and I'm going to look and see how we're doing on questions and answers. Here's one, and this probably, maybe this is one Pat, you and Mike can answer. There was mention of the Peabody Museum at Harvard holding some collection items or materials discovered by Charles Conrad Abbott. Are there other museums in the tri-state area or in New England that also hold some of his Abbott's archaeological findings?
So yes, Abbott's, there's a tremendous collection at the State Museum in New Jersey. And I highly recommend anybody who's interested in this topic to visit the State Museum in New Jersey. They've got wonderful exhibits, and there are a lot of materials there that were collected in the Abbott marshlands. Additionally, Abbott collected some materials. He worked for the University of Pennsylvania Museum for a while. Some of his collections ended up there. He collected for Peabody Museum in Harvard. I do think I recall that some of his things may have ended up also at the Smithsonian as well. So those are just the places I'm familiar with.
Okay, thank you, Pat. So here's a question from Rowena Madden. Rowena is a staff member at the in the Secretary of State's office, working with the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs. She asked, with the next steps for the Trent House, does this relate specifically to the Trent House, or more generally to Lenape history in New Jersey. We have some ability to connect themes and of New Jersey's Lenape history specifically to the Trent House through our archaeological artifacts. So for example, we also have found artifacts related to Abbott's owned pottery, which again indicates a ceremonial, potentially a ceremonial aspect to Lenape activity on the Trent House site. We also have uncovered, we meaning Hunter Research, has uncovered several pieces of trade goods that were adapted or modified by Lenape people for their own particular purposes. So again, suggesting part of the history that is specific to the site has to do with contact in the trade between Europeans and Lenape people, perhaps prior to the actual settlement of Europeans on the land. But we think, again, as I sort of mentioned earlier, we kind of think of our job, kind of responsibility, because what Trent, if we're thinking of the Trent House and the property that the Trent House initially covered, or that Trent initially owned, it's a big chunk of Trenton. And similarly, some of the things that, some of those themes and experiences that happened at the Trent House, we can generalize or we can link to others in the broader history of the region. So it's going to be a mix. But I think part of our job is to help people recognize that our history at the Trent House is also based in the history of Lenape people on the land that the house, as the museum currently sits. I hope that was helpful.
Sam, there was
yeah.
also, there was a question, I don't know if you saw this in the answered, about any archaeological materials that were found that were made of non-local materials at the Trent House.
Oh, wow. I'm not the right person to answer that question. I do know that Richard Veit is holding one of the sessions in this conference is going to be more about the archaeology. And one of the speakers there is Richard Adamczyk, I think is how you pronounce his name, who was a student of Richard Veit's and did his master's thesis on the archaeological evidence of Native occupation of the Trent House property. So save that question for him, and you'll hopefully get an answer, one that I'm sorry I cannot provide.
Sam, maybe I would just, if I could add to that, that in our work on the stone tools for the Abbott Marshlands, one of the things that we came to understand is that the evidence of the different materials that are used in those stone tools really demonstrate a really sophisticated understanding of the landscape. You know, people would know that you had to go 100 miles north and 20 miles east to a particular quarry to get a particular type of stone that would be best for a particular tool. So there's lots of evidence that in the Abbott Marshlands of really understanding a much wider landscape as well as trade.
Yeah, and that was the other point I was going to make about trade. One of the things I've learned through my reading is how much trade there was beyond the borders of where the Lenape territory was, with other groups that would bring exchange items in trade, and that included certain minerals, rocks and stones that would be appropriate for certain uses. I'm gonna look and see. I thought I saw another question. Megan McCall asked, I'm wondering if the email addresses for the presenters have been shared anywhere. And so I don't know if they're on the Historical Commission's website. Mark, can you answer that?
I can take a quick look to see if it's on our conference website. If not, then I can also send them into the chat.
All right, great, thanks. And there was another, trying to get out of, I'm sort of stuck here on a particular, I don't know why I am. There's another question about whether there are other museums in New Jersey that are doing similar kinds of work to what's going on at Tupahawking and the Trent House. I guess I'm not very familiar with that, but I don't know whether, Pat, you've come across any, and Trinity, have you seen any others?
I can help.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know of any other museums in North Jersey that are doing similar work. But hopefully after this conference, that'll change.
Yeah, we hope so. We hope so. Trinity, I had a question about your work with adults. I mean, one of the things that you told us about was your work with teachers and students in classrooms, and wondering, have you made presentations to adults? And were there questions or lack of information or misconceptions similar? Or did you have different issues you needed to address with them?
That is a very good question. I have done quite a few, I call them trainings rather than presentations with adults. There's a lot of unlearning that you have to do with adults. So it's a different to tackle. Working with young people, they're more receptive, they're more prepared to deal with the fact that they don't know things, while adults feel very confident that they know things. So it's a different mountain to tackle. Typically, those kinds of conversations concentrate on, of course, on history, but on the nuances around sharing that information with young people. One of the things that I like to highlight on is how you talk about Native cultures, and talking about them constantly in the past tense, which is something that we do subconsciously, but they are alive. They are communities today. It's important not to just talk about them in the past tense. Even the terminology you use for tribal people, and it's something that I have to catch myself doing. An example is calling people members of a tribe. A tribe is a sovereign nation, they're citizens of a tribe. So it's those kind of small things that I tend to get into when I am doing training or educational programs with adults, particularly educators.
Thank you. Looking to see if there are other comments or questions. I do see that a couple of people have suggested other museums or places in New Jersey that might be doing this, and that one is Waterloo Village, and the other one is the Mawa Museum, if I'm saying that correctly, is currently exhibiting Lenape. So I don't see any more questions. Mark, just double check and make sure I'm not missing any.
I'm not sure if this one was answered. It says, how will the Trent House ensure that their materials are appropriate for middle and high school audiences? The Abbott Marshlands used an expert on elementary school education.
Right, great question. our first foray into that is going to be actually reaching out to youth of those age groups and seeing what their reaction is in terms of interest level, and how it's appropriate in terms of building on maybe what they already know, or where we can build on things and where we may have to go back and sort of deal with some other issues or background information beforehand. Trinity, what is your thought on that?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think including those age groups in the conversation, so we are ensuring that we are tackling subjects that they have interest in, and also having educational experts, making sure that the programs and the videos we are making reach their level of understanding.
Right, and now that we know Mike, who knows, we may be reaching out to you. I do think it's also important for us to say that we haven't, these videos need to be surrounded by additional material. They cannot just stand on their own and sort of show this video and that's, we've check it off, we've done our thing. So we will need to develop, as the Tupelo-Hocking Nature Center and the Friends for the Abbott Marshlands have done, actual lesson plans, actual curriculum, actual activities and so on to accompany them. We think of these videos as our first step in producing something that that we can build on. Looking to see if there are other questions. Oh, here's another one. At the Great Swamp Outdoor Education Center in Chatham, we teach about the Lenape, both past and present. We have a very authentic wigwam model, have kids try activities from the late woodland periods, but we also discuss how the Lenape are alive and well today. We hold an annual event in cooperation with the members of the Ramapo tribe before COVID, they point out. Here is another comment. I'm an Alaska Native transplant here in New Jersey, a member of a tribe. I'm sorry, I won't be able to pronounce it, so I'm not going to try. Very curious about local Indigenous groups. And so there's some follow-up on that. They are appreciative of having this forum. So here's someone who says New Jersey is a political state with political boundaries. What about Lenape museums or festivals in Lenape land beyond New Jersey? Places where contemporary tribal citizens gather. Trinity, what can you tell us about that?
If I am understanding the question correctly, the individual is asking what other, outside of New Jersey, where are there resources? Well, I can say that there are quite a few organizations in the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is part of our ancestral lands that are currently working with, and I am personally working with, on ensuring that they have Indigenous voices at the table. Philadelphia and Pennsylvania at large is particularly interesting because there is no sovereign tribal nation to advocate for Native people. So it's been a bit of a struggle there for Native people to be able to have a seat at the table. If you go further north, there is a center in Manhattan, which, the southern tip of New York is part of our ancestral land, part of Lenape-Hocking as well. There is a resource center. I don't want to get the name wrong. I believe it is called the Lenape Center of Manhattan, but I'm not 100% sure. I could do a little Googling and get that for you. So I've worked with that center, and they have actually come down to Philadelphia and helped with some projects there as well. So there are some other things going on outside of the state. you know, in reality, for most of those things, I tell people, you know, to reach out through social media. In Philadelphia, Indigenous 215 tries to keep any events or any exhibits or anything like that posted about Lenape history and things of that nature.
I see we're running out of time, but I do note that there have been a number of questions about resources, books, other museums, other sites, and so on. So we'll do our best to work with the Historical Commission to put something together and have it available through their conference website, I hope. And Mark says definitely he will. All right. Thank you all very much. Look forward to the rest of the conference. Bye now.